Okay, so today in those 20 minutes, I'll try to explain things that could be explained in like probably a few hours. I'm going to try and be very, very concise. We at Roboto, we've been working on the outsource for almost 2 decades with AAA publishers, mid-size publishers, indie devs. So I think that we've got a whole spectrum of different experiences, which I should share with you, just for you to be able to benefit mostly from the outsource work, which actually happens sooner or later to most of the publishers, developers who are involved in gaming industry. So I will divide it into 5 different main pillars. The first one being symmetry. Does it work? Yeah. All right. So some of you might think there is no symmetry between a client and a vendor because one pays and the other gets paid. In that context, of course, it's true. But what I'm trying to say here is that whatever level of certain behaviors you would expect from your vendor, you should give it back in return, right? So then the relation is going to be healthy, basically. So for instance, if you want them to be professional and objective, then ask yourself a question: what is the real assessment, the basis for my assessment of their work? Is it based on verified facts? Or perhaps it's just the impressions, right? Am I just having a bad day? Is my assessment objective or very, very subjective? Because only the objective one is going to work, obviously. Now, the next thing, when we think about the symmetrical approaches, there are usually 2 basic approaches to your relation with your vendors, outsourced vendors. It's either transactional approach or relational approach. Transactional basically means you just want to have the best deal for today, which usually means financial best deal for today. And it's tempting. While the other one, relational, so to speak, is the one when you would like to have a partner that actually helps you deliver perfect products to the market. When you develop and you build up that partnership, then basically that's going to work better for you. The transactional one, again, although being very, very tempting, usually is a highway to hell for your products, which I'm going to explain later on. Now, the next 2 things are more or less about speed and timelines. Well, this is like the crucial part of outsourcing, right? You would like to have it quick. You would like to have someone who actually is good at communicating, etc. Now, the question is, that's the question you need to ask yourself. Am I giving that back in return, right? Which means, am I supporting enough to my vendor, etc. Now, what you need to remember is that this thing called deadline, the dreadful thing called deadline, for your game is, if you're working on one game, you've got one deadline, which is your launch of the product. For your vendor, if they are like more experienced than just a beginner, they've got hundreds of deadlines. For you, for 20 or 30 or 40 other clients, and they need to stick to all of them. So that means you are the leader here. You need to be upfront. And actually, you should be the one who cares more about the deadline than even the vendor. Now, and the last thing is that you need to always try at least and be cool-headed. So yelling doesn't help, does it, right? Because if you yell at the person, then probably they can also lose the nerves. So that's the foundation of the symmetrical approach, so to speak, to your cooperation with any vendor. Now, a little case study. So here are the project details of a thing we did sometime in the past. What I would like to draw your attention to is the timeline. So the original timeline was 6 months. Then it got, of course, shortened to 2.5. But the deadline, of course, wasn't postponed that much. There was no LQA phase, which means testing. And the text was absolutely defragmented. So 18 different batches, constantly re-edited. Hell of a work for 7 languages. 90,000 words per language, which total would be something like 600,000. Now, at a certain point in time, towards the end of the project, we received feedback from the producer. The guy who was actually the frontman of that company. He picked on one word in Polish. There was a phrase, utilize the dead, and he didn't like the translation into Polish of this one particular word. And he said it's an ultimate crime on the language, and there is plenty more. Oh, it's a very scary feedback you get from your client, right? But first of all, the translation was right. objectively right, because we prove that with dictionaries. Second of all, there were no other cases whatsoever for any other language. So then he extrapolated that one word into saying that, I'm really doubtful about the remaining part of your Polish localization, and probably there are similar things with 6 other languages, right? So the question is, was he symmetrical? Was he cool-headed? Was he objective? I mean, these are more or less rhetorical questions, right? Obviously, he wasn't. So luckily, he had some superiors that controlled the process, and we resolved the situation very quickly. By the way, off the record, that guy lost his job after this game was launched. So, of course, not in any connection with this situation, I hope. But actually, he did lose his job. So that's the first thing. Now, modesty. Now, when you are a developer, whatever you do, basically, you don't like to be in a position that somebody questions your skills, right? I mean, hands up, anyone who really likes to be criticized. There you go. But the criticism needs to be objective, more or less, right? Then you accept that. Now, but no one really likes to have their basic know-how questioned, right? So when people don't do that to you, you should not do that to the other people, obviously, right? Now, if you do question, then the question is on what grounds. Now, the fair assumption is that whenever you work with outsource, that you should assume that you don't know everything about everything, right? So if you are a good programmer, I don't know, 3D concept artist, whatever, you probably don't know much about the process of localizing your title, right? So accept suggestions from the people who have been doing that for like 10 years, 15 years, or 20 years, and you're gonna be better off. Which leads us to the situation or the fundamental question, what are the psychological profile of a person who should be the frontman of your organization when you work with outsource, whatever kind of outsource it is? This is a non-exclusive list, of course, just a few things you should remember. Now, if I were to draw your attention to any of these, so first thing is empathy. Right? I mean, if you are capable of feeling yourself into the situation or feelings or line of reasoning of the other party, that's going to save your day many times. This is what we need to have in ourselves when we work with the clients. We need to be very, very empathetic. Now, the other thing is, and it's quite frequently forgotten, is that the person who on your team, on your development team, is responsible for this outsource work, theoretically, preferably should have some experience as an outsource previously, or at least as a frontman to your organization. I don't know, a biz dev guy, somebody who makes presentations, basically somebody who has got some prior contact with the external world. Because what happens, especially with smaller indies, is that you're free more or less, so you're gonna, do that stuff, right? So, a programmer is selected to do that, or a guy or a girl who has not done it before, and it's gonna wreck everybody's nerves, including that person, because they are just not cut out for it. So it's really, really a good idea to think before you start, who should be that person. So that's modesty and a case study connected with modesty. Some project details. Come on. Move forward. All right, so this is the background, right? So there is again, we localize, and part of it was supposed to be LQA phase. I mean, by the time we quoted linguistic testing, we had come to realize that this publisher is either strapped for cash or they're just stingy, so they don't like actually spending money. So we didn't want to tell them, look, it should be 400 hours per language, because they would probably go bananas, right? So we said, okay, 160 is a fair amount of hours you should spend on it. And it's still verging on the impossible, right? Because imagine the amount of text you need to read through, you need to report, you need to correct. So this is really, really a very strenuous job. In 160 hours, close to impossible, but it's a fair compromise. And then we receive that feedback from the guy. So they estimate the playthrough is 10 hours, so 10 hours? How come you came up with 160? I mean, probably we want to rob them, right? I can't tell you how the situation has actually been resolved, because it's still like in progress. We are still trying to explain to the client like the basic rules that linguistic testing is actually governed by. Hopefully that's going to work out, because no testing would be a nightmare. So this is a display of, I mean, immediately the people who were on my side of business and they dealt with that project, they say, okay, this guy has no experience. I mean, playing through a game as an end user is a completely different thing to being a linguistic tester, right? I mean, you need to look under every stone, you need to open all the boxes, you need to read all the descriptions, you need to cover all the subplots, all the dialogues, etc. So like you play through and that's it. So modesty is the second pillar of good outsourcing. Now the third one is anticipation. So plan ahead for everyone's sake. Now, it's verging on a cliche if I say that the kind of outsourced work that we do, like dubbing or testing or localization itself, is procrastinated, delayed, put off, postponed, neglected, disregarded. I could go on with synonyms like that. Now, why such things happen, even though this is a very important part of shipping your product? Different reasons. Those are the main reasons. So, for instance, there is no prior experience on the developer's part. So they actually don't know how to approach it, when to approach that stage, or they just don't understand the potentiality of the outcome of this outsourced work. Now, what are the golden rules in my line of business, which is dubbing, localization, testing, etc.? So first of all, you should start at a late stage in your development, but not too late, which means when you've got your assets more or less finalized or close to finalization, then you should start doing it so you don't have to redo things from scratch, because that's going to be very expensive. Yeah, right, because I can't see it here. The second thing is you should always anticipate that down the line, down the production line, there's going to be some changes on your part. So anticipate the buffer time, some time to actually allow for changes. And the third thing is about following the right sequence of how to approach things. So for instance, I'm not a master chef, but when I do scrambled eggs, I do not start with frying eggs on a cold frying pan, right? So I heat up the frying pan, then I do bacon or onion, and then I finally do the eggs, right? The same goes for a project like this one. Let's imagine you've got a dubbing project, right? So it's a very short sequence of how you should do it. So first, remember about prepping stuff, so reference materials, compiling your script, dialogues, text, whatever else you can offer to your outsource. Then do the translation and proofreading. Then important thing before you start recordings, do the first LQA, which is testing. Why is it important? Because it saves you a lot of pickup sessions during recordings, right? If you go to recording straight off after translation, there will be a lot of contextual mistakes. And then you will have to call in your actors again, pay them again, which is going to be like a double effort, and you should avoid that. So then do the VO, then do the LQA. Of course, it's a very simplified chart. Initially, I had like 12 different, rounds, but I would probably bore you to death with it, and I don't want that. But anyway, that gives you an idea how you should approach a dubbing project. Why an example like that? Because the next case study will actually involve recording things. So it's an indie publisher, adventure psychological game. So we've got the English text to first translate and then record, 3,000 lines. No LQA testing prior to recordings. Well, assets are late, obviously, and then recordings windows shortened to just 7 days instead of having 2 weeks, which is again a very difficult setup. So we did that, and then we received one of the most difficult emails I ever received, like this. Evidently, we received a faulty product. LQA found, check this, 12 lines to re-record. I expect an apology and compensation. Now, first of all, 12 lines, is it many or not many? It wouldn't be many even if he had the LQA phase before recordings, which he didn't have. I mean, 12 lines out of 3,000, it's what, like 3/10 of 1% probably, while the acceptable ratio would be 2 to 3% of pickup lines. And that is just a part of this email, which I didn't want to quote in full because it was full of insults. Pavel from Reboot, are you here? No, you're not here. So he knows how I can furiously type at my keyboard when I'm angry. So yeah, my initial answer was like that. Then I cooled off, deleted all the colorful references to this guy's emotional intelligence. Then I made the second review and then the third review. And then I took a deep breath, did the fourth review and sent back a very professional, cool-headed, objective answer, to which I never got any reply. Never an apology for this outburst of hate, but they continue to work with us. So at least that guy actually probably listened to reason. So yeah, anticipation can get you in trouble if you don't anticipate. Now the fourth one is reasonableness, if I pronounce that correctly, by the way. Reasonableness. Okay, so obviously there will always be high expectations when you outsource your work because you pay for it, right? I mean, that's a cliche, but yeah. Now the question is, what are the reasonable expectations and not so reasonable expectations, right? So on the left-hand side, you will see the reasonable ones, obvious ones. They are self-explanatory, so I don't probably have to go into details here. Of course, it's not an inclusive list, but just like the basics, right? Now, what is not reasonable? A few examples. They are presented as quotes, although they are not real quotes from real people. It's more what like people feel. They don't tell you that in the face, but that's what they imply in their communication, right? So those three things are one of the most common things we bump into. And I absolutely love the one at the bottom with those three knobs, where you've got quality, speed, and price. And that's my favorite setup, which means I wanted to have it with perfect quality, with the quickest way possible, at the cheapest price possible. We joke around that you cannot compromise the three. You need to choose two, right? I mean, it's either this or that. You cannot have everything. Like, it's a fairy tale. This setup is a fairy tale, which a naive child might believe in, but we are not children, right? So we should not dream this fairy tale, because this fairy tale, when you expect such things, can turn into a nightmare. And I will show you an example of a nightmare. So, project details. No. Here, right. Okay, so that was a very, very ambitious project, an RPG, heavy in narrative, over 1.2 million words, which is almost 3 times the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And the developer wants to have it done in less than 4 months. Which is insane, basically. I mean, we calculated that we had to have 6 to 7 translators at the same time working just on that project for 4 months, and perhaps we would have made it on time. Now, the point is, we were supposed to do Polish and Russian, and we got entangled with absolutely surreal negotiations with the client. The sort of negotiations you would expect to have, at a flea market in Cairo or Dubai or Ankara, right? It was like, yeah, give me less and less and less and less. And actually, the bone of discontent at the end was $0.005 cents per word. So they chose another vendor from US for Polish and Russian. I thought, okay, perhaps that's possible. Perhaps you can get it cheaper in California and better than we in Poland. Fine, no problem. But this developer actually signed a publishing deal with a company from Poland called Techland. They were the global publisher. And Techland realized quickly that the Polish text is crap, absolute crap. So they commissioned us to correct everything, which was total heavy editing. And this developer was actually re-invoiced by Techland for the work we did. And they paid, check this, 5 times more than they economized initially when they bickered about this $0.005 cents, right? And to add, insult to injury, they refused to correct Russian, which was equally bad. And then this is what happened in the Russian media. Just 2 of the quotes, not the harshest ones. Quotes about the level of Russian localization. By the way, these guys don't listen. They still do the same thing. They recently released another RPG, and in Polish, for instance, the word, when you put a box close, like close this box, it's translated into Polish as close enough, almost there. right? In every single instance, right? And it's just one of the examples. Okay, moving over to the last one, which is transparency, international. In short, you should be open, sincere, and truthful when you talk to your vendor, whatever the subject matter is, even if it's a difficult one. The point is, professional outsource companies actually aim for long-term relations because that's what builds up the reputations. And I know how easily you can wreck your reputation if you don't do that. So draw from the fact that these guys out there actually want to retain your relation and they will do whatever it takes to keep you happy, right? So if difficult time occurs in your marriage, so to speak, as in any marriage, even perfect one, you will have silent days. So my suggestion would be talk openly and truthfully. Do not insult anyone's mother. Just try to be basically fair and objective, right? Those are the 3 golden rules. So it should be a weighted, carefully worded feedback, not like, you are such, apps, etc. No. That's not something that will actually push you towards any solution. Now, think about the joint action. Focus on the joint action because you want to have a remedy solution, right? And perhaps I shouldn't be saying that as an outsource company, but if after that you write a post-mortem, and in that post-mortem you have enough arguments to divorce your vendor, then divorce your vendor. But again, do not throw plates against your bedroom wall because it can hit your head, right? I mean, just shake hands, say good luck, and say goodbye, find another vendor. That's going to be like something that is going to make you look like a paragon knight in that relation. Now I'm going to show you the most surreal client dissatisfaction I have actually personally encountered. You've got the details here. This is a very important thing. That was a non-exclusive deal, which means we did some of the stuff, some other people did some other stuff, which I personally don't like, because the accountability dissipates when it's divided into different vendors. But, well, they wanted to have it, fine. So we completed our task, we sent it over, clients seemed to be happy, but they cut off communication. So we thought perhaps the person who was responsible is no longer at this company, or they don't have any more product to work on. Who knows? But finally, we meet them at Gamescom in Cologne, accidentally, by the way, and we decided to ask them, look, guys, what happened? Here is the excerpt from our real conversation. Yeah, right. Frankly, your Asian translation was so bad, we had big trouble publishing in Japan, for example. But we didn't do Asian languages for this game, And we're like, oh, really? That was the kind of reaction that we got. I'm not sure if we're going to work together or not, but, well, everything could have been saved if only they had communicated that in the first place, because it took us like 10 seconds to retrieve an invoice which showed no Asian languages, and the file, empty Asian languages. No, we didn't do it. And they kept silent for something like a year, probably replacing us with somebody else because we screwed up Asian languages on which we never worked, actually. So that's the 5th one, transparency. So just to recapitulate, whenever you outsource, try to be symmetrical with your approach. Try to be modest, remain modest. Anticipate things before they happen. Just be reasonable with your expectations. You are entitled to high expectations, but be reasonable with them. And in the end, just be truthful and honest, meaning be transparent. In other words, be smart when you do that. Thank you.